the message. So again, welcome to everyone. I want to share this morning as a follow-on from last week. And last week, as I started sharing from Ephesians Chapter 6, that famous passage about the armor of God, we shared on the topic of really just being strengthened by God, finding our strength in Him. And so this has been, again, sitting with me this week. I jokingly said to someone a little bit earlier that I think I'm preaching to myself at the moment. So I hope some of you are getting something out of it, but I'm certainly finding it relevant for me. So anyhow, that's kind of where I am at the moment. But I want to continue with this thought of the battle. There's a fight. There's a struggle is the word that Paul uses, and his encouragement, his exhortation in actual fact, not only to be strengthened and finding our strength in God, but to be prepared for a battle. So let me read to you again just the first part of that passage from Ephesians chapter 6 from verse 10. And he says there, from now on, from this time forward, be strengthened in the Lord and in his mighty strength. Put on, literally clothe yourself. Put your clothes on. Don't be found naked in this battle. Put on the full armor of God, that you might be able to stand against the strategies of the devil. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the world powers of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenlies. Because of this, take up, again he says, the full armor of God, that you might be able to stand in the day of evil, and having accomplished everything, to stand. So again, we hear in this what Paul is writing to the Ephesians and to us, that we're in a fight, we're in a struggle. So yes, we're in the midst of a global pandemic. We in Gauteng are experiencing this like incredible third wave. But Paul is speaking here to believers specifically. And he's saying to us that there's another battle that is going on. Yes, there's this fight that we're in, but there's also another fight and perhaps another dimension to the battle. So in fact, this passage is famously called sort of Paul's call to arms to the believers, to the Christians. Martin Lloyd-Jones said this about this passage: there is nothing more urgently important for all who claim the name of Christian than to grasp and to understand the teaching of this particular section of scriptures. So again, as believers in this life, in our lives, we're expected to experience opposition, struggle, spiritual opposition that we call to stand against. And it's a war, it's a battle that in fact, as we read the New Testament, as we read the Gospels, as we immerse ourselves in Paul's letters, we realize that this battle has been won. Jesus is victorious. He has risen from the dead. He's ascended to the right hand of the Father, and the battle has been won. Yet, in this life, we still experience this war. And it's in a sense that the devil is defeated, but he's going to go down fighting. He is wanting to inflict as much harm as he can, and he's wanting to take as many people as possible. And so therefore, there is still a fight to be fought. And in that sense, some commentators say, we're called to stand. The battle has been won, the fight has been won, but we need to stand in that victory that has been won for us. So just thinking of the struggle, the word that Paul uses, we are still in a struggle. Paul says, put on the armor to be able to stand against the strategies. I think the old translation said the wiles of the devil. Literally, the word says their methods. And it's like, well, the enemy has methods. He has a ways and means committee. And then Paul says that our struggle is not against flesh and blood. Often we mistake that. We focus on people and personalities. And he says, no, it's against rulers, against authorities, against world powers of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenlies. And again, Paul is not trying to sort of categorize demons and forces and everything like that. He's trying to emphasize two things. He emphasizes the nature of the struggle. The struggle is not against flesh and blood. The struggle is against forces of evil, spiritual forces of evil. And so the battle is a spiritual battle. And then the struggle there, I was just looking at that word, in actual fact, 2 weeks ago, talking to someone in the congregation, and just realizing that it's initially a word for wrestling, but that's not, in actual fact, it can be used far broader than that. It can be used in the context of any battle, any fight. But the emphasis is an intense struggle. The struggle that we often find ourselves in, and we're going to look at some of that just now, is not just like, this, fiddly little fight or, just some simple temptation or something like that. It is a real, ongoing, sometimes just wrestle and struggle that we're having against forces of evil. So again, this fight is fought on so many fronts. It is fought globally. There's the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenlies. This is happening on a global scale. In our continent and our country, there are specific battles and opposition that we're facing. And then, again, personally, each one of us, this is a struggle that we experience in our lives, in our bodies, in our minds, in our hearts. So personally, we are expected to experience opposition and struggle. It might be that this past year, you feel like you've been in a struggle. I mean, we see that all around us. People are battling with work. They're struggling just to make ends meet. It could be the lockdown, the pandemic, families. Chatting to Costa, I asked him, in actual fact, in a while, he's going to do kind of a follow-on, more relates to Ephesians Chapter 5. He was just talking about how many marriages have been struggling in lockdown, relationships with families. Again, as we've chatting to Lynn and Nicolette as we started, the struggle for you in the past few weeks could have just been physical. It could have been a battle with sickness, with illness. It could have been emotionally, physically, mentally. So there's all these different aspects, and sometimes they all come crashing in to almost one thing sometimes, where we experience an intense struggle. But there's also a danger that we can just limit this to ourselves and make it very individualistic, that all Paul is talking about is my simple struggle with temptation. So let me say that obviously that is real, and it is part of the battle, and it is part of the struggle that we need to put the armor on for. But it's a lot bigger than that. So globally, Paul is talking about powers that are at work in our world. The one word he talks about rulers and authorities and world powers of darkness. So evil on a much larger scale. I loved, and I've shared this so often, Dallas Willard talking about strongholds and powers and that. And Dallas Willard really saying the root, the core of a stronghold is in fact an idea. So we can think in terms of strongholds as a lot of isms, racism, individualism, socialism, capitalism, communism. Paul talks about the new humanity in his letters, particularly this one. And he talks about this new humanity that the Son of God has inaugurated. He's won for us. He started this program of his plan for our planet. But what are the ideas and the ideologies that would smother or detract from that? So what about corruption, poverty? I said racism just now, classism, sexism, and in fact, Paul mentions this, greed as well. The real battle, the intense ongoing struggle, is often against systemic evil and injustice. So how do we fight this? How do we engage in this battle? Well, Paul says that, again, we stand. He says we're to put on the armor of God. In the context of this passage and throughout the letter, he calls us to pray. So again, just coming, not thinking individualistically, but in terms of just personally, we're called to stand against this, to be strengthened. He starts out to say to be strengthened in God. We need to find strength in a mighty God and in his awesome power and strength so that we are able to engage in this battle. And then Paul says two things that we've highlighted, I've spoken a lot about, even Alexander did, in this letter. In chapters 4 and 5, he says, we're to walk. And when he spoke about putting on, in chapter 6, he says, we're to clothe ourselves in the armor of God. But previously in chapter 4 and 5, Paul was saying we're to clothe ourselves in this newness of life, this new humanity that Christ has bought for us. So just to go back to a couple of verses that I was reading again this week. In chapter 4, in verse 17, Paul says this is, I tell you this, I insist on it in the Lord, that you must no longer live, don't walk anymore as the Gentiles did, in the futility of their thinking. It's the same word when Paul talks about the darkness of this age. He talks about the darkness that we used to walk in. They and we at one stage were darkened in their understanding, separated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardening of their hearts. Having lost all sensitivity, they have given themselves over to sensuality so as to indulge in every kind of impurity, and they are full of greed. So it's interesting here that Paul is saying there's almost like this progression. Paul is saying that wrong thinking leads, in actual fact, to darkness in understanding. Our minds become darkened. Wrong thinking leads to ignorance and, in fact, a separation from God. And this, in turn, leads to walking or living in a way that we lose sensitivity. Our hearts become hard, and we give ourselves over, in actual fact, to things like indulgence and become full of greed. He goes on to say, he says, however, this is not the life that we have learned in Jesus. When you heard about Christ and you were taught in him in accordance with the truth that is in Jesus, you were taught with regard to your former self to put off, to take off those clothes, to discard those old garments which were being corrupted in deceitful desires. And we we're meant, he says, to be made new in the attitudes of our minds. So our minds, our thinking, our ideas are meant to be renewed and become new. We're meant to have new ideas about how to live, the world we live in, how we think. And so it's interesting from what Willard was saying. You see this in what Paul is saying here. It starts with the way we think, and it becomes the way we live. And he says there, so put on the new self. Literally, Paul is saying we need to clothe ourselves with the garments of Christ, the newness of humanity that he has for us, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. Incredible. Get rid of the stinky old clothes, those holy pajamas, that old way of living, and practice. We spoke about this a lot when I shared about Alexander's book, when Alexander shared. Practice putting on. Get used to putting on new clothes, new habits, true righteousness, holiness that God has bought for us, that Christ has bought for us. So just to further that, how do we fight corruption? Because Paul actually uses this word. He says, you were taught with regard to your old self, to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires. And then he goes on a little bit later, he says, so then, therefore, each of you should put off falsehood and speak truthfully to your neighbor, because we're all members of one body. So corruption for Paul is like, we experience corruption. We've experienced corruption. It's part of the old humanity. We're expected to put on new habits and a new humanity. And then Paul says that is the way we live. So don't speak untruth to one another. Speak truth to your neighbor. And then he says, in your anger, verse 26, do not sin. Don't even let the sun go down while you're angry. Do not give the devil a foothold. Anyone who's been stealing, don't steal anymore. Work, do something useful with your hands, that you may have something to share with those in need. I found a lot of these things fascinating, to think of the fact of what we were talking earlier about, habits, new humanities, and in fact, this battle. That corruption sometimes is just a habit, part of the old humanity. I'll give you a silly example if I can share with you, but most of you know we had a fire last year. We had some renovations that had to be done as per usual. Renovations often take longer than expected. We had delays with lockdown and holidays and things like that. And anyhow, everything's finished, I'm pleased to say. It's been finished for a while. But there was an outstanding issue with the main contractor. And literally a month ago, we sorted out the emails at the bank, and we finalized emails with the bank, the insurers, and the contractor and that. And he said, I'll sort this out by the end of the week. It'll be sorted out. And so just left it. The next week, I messaged him again, and I said, just want to remind you that this issue is still outstanding. No, definitely this week, I'll sort it out. That became the following week voice notes and calls. And from that moment onward, none of my calls were answered. I left copious voice notes, messages, things like that. And it literally took a month. So yesterday, we concluded that little thing. But the funny thing there is that I found I was having this battle even in myself, because Paul says here, he says, speak truth to one another. And then he says, and don't get angry. And here I am getting angry because someone keeps promising something. I don't know if you have that, but someone says tomorrow, definitely this week. And literally this is 4 or 5 weeks later, and you're going, but it's just like one promise after another promise after another promise. And that becomes just habit. And it seems to pervade so much of what is happening around us. So again, corruption, Paul says, like, speak truthfully to one another. Here's a habit to counter corruption, truthfulness. But then immediately I'm getting angry because someone's not being truthful, and then I'm battling. I'm having this struggle with anger and frustration and that anyhow. So, small example of sometimes what's happening on a larger scale. But this happens when we think of even racism, sexism, so many examples. There's a sense in which these broader, even global issues need to be fought and countered, each one of us personally. How do I challenge myself continually not to fall into old patterns of deceitfulness or bad habits or racism or sexism or whatever? And we have spoken about that extensively. So this morning, I want to just land on this thing also, just to think a bit wider than that on a global scale, and think even in terms of our community, where we think of how do we engage with systematic or systemic injustice, corruption, things like that. As I read earlier in chapter 4, Paul ends his rant about darkened minds and behavior with being filled with greed. And it was an interesting one. I was thinking, so I think a week or two ago, I was reading the G7 countries had their G7 summit, and we heard very excitedly that specifically the G7 have donated 1 billion vaccines to the parts of the world that need it now. I was like, gee, that's very generous. That's amazing of them. Anyhow, I then went to read a little bit further on this, and one journalist was particularly brutal. And they said, well, so the G7 countries have donated 1 billion vaccines out of a total of 2 billion excess vaccines that they've procured. So they have 2 billion, they've procured vaccines because of their wealth and the influence and everything like that. 2 billion over and above what they can need in their own country, but they've given half of them away. A bit more challenging. Interestingly, some of the other authors or journalists followed on from this, and they said the problem is not only that, the problem is often these promises that are made by the G7, and particularly at G7 summit, are not always followed through with, and they don't actually land up doing what they've promised. Again, I thought, just speaking truthfully. And the thing of greed is not just, about you wanting another piece of chocolate. It is something that we're facing on a global scale. So it's not just the G7. It's we had some bad news in our surrounds this past week, listening as well to about 22 billion in terms of irregularities and audits in local government. Just this past year, we have a 22 billion rand problem. And the one example was the one municipality in Kabeja where money that was, it sounded like specifically allocated to COVID funding and relief, COVID-19 funding. One of the municipalities bought their mayor a new car. Now, again, I don't have the details of that. Maybe the mayor was a frontline worker distributing vaccines and he needed a brand new Mercedes, but yeah, not so sure about that. So again, we fight sin, temptation. We can battle greed in our own lives, but there's a larger war that has been fought around us. And Paul encourages us to put on armor to stand against that, and that the struggle is against rulers, authorities, and world powers. The struggle is against God's agenda for a new humanity. And it is it's a battle, and it's not going to go away easily. It's a fight that we're called to engage in. So one of the things that Paul says is pray and support one another. In verse 18, this whole passage ends with pray in the Spirit on all occasions with all kinds of prayers and requests. With this in mind, be alert and always keep on praying for all of God's people. So we can, even as a smaller community, pray and support those that are on the front lines. So we've had some people that are sick in our midst, and we've prayed for them. But I always encourage you, and sometimes it's not just pray for them. It's, encourage them, send them voice notes, call them, maybe send them words and visions and verses, and, pray for them and send them stuff that will encourage them. In the case of Bev, she sent books. But there's other things that people practically do. You can take her on a meal. You can offer to do some shopping or run errands, fetch children. There's all kinds of things in which when someone is in the midst of a struggle, we can support them. And so I thought again of the past few weeks of just a few people literally in our midst. So when we think of the struggle for education, when we think of the future of our country, the youth, and we think of just the importance of education, how do we pray for our country? Well, I think practically, we often are praying for the teachers in our midst. We're praying for those that are involved in education, and we can encourage so that the battle in terms of our nation, one of the things that we can do, I don't know how to solve the education problem in South Africa, but I can pray for some teachers and some people that I know, and I can find ways to be a support and an encouragement even to them. It doesn't end there, but I'm just saying that's a start. So then when we think of poverty and injustice and systematic injustice historically in our country, well, there's some people who've been busy with that for the last 30 years. At Sparrow, that was her whole vision for Sparrow. And so there's Peter and Jackie that are on the front line, Tommy as well. And if you ask Jackie, she would say on many occasions, yes, there's struggles against systemic problems, but often it's literally spiritual warfare. And she asks for prayer, and she gets teachers praying, and they pray on the property because she realizes that it is an intense spiritual battle that needs some spiritual solutions. So again, I think there are times, often every week, that the struggle that we're engaged in, although it's not my struggle, there are people that you and I know that are on the front lines, and we can be praying, supporting, encouraging them, because that's where they're standing. Another one I was thinking of is old Robin. So Robin is involved in advocacy in child advocacy. She started an NGO called For the Voiceless, just having a voice for the vulnerable, for those who don't have a voice. And again, there is systemic injustice that she is positioning herself on the front lines to fight and engage in this battle. And we as a church, as friends and others, can again support her in that battle. So I'm going to pause my recording while I use two other examples because I'm not sure. Carry on. So I've mentioned a few of the people that we've been praying for, but there are so many others. And there are issues that people are engaged with that I'm not even aware of. On so many people in this room. And as you become aware of them, sometimes our wrestling and struggling is for us to pray, put on the armor of God, to pray and support those that are on the front line. We are part of the battle. We might not just be at the coalface of the battle. The battle is around us. The battle is in the realm that we're part of. But there are other people that maybe are a bit on the front line. So let me end with what we shared last week. Paul says to all of us, be strengthened in the Lord and in his mighty strength. So I would encourage you, as I've shared all different things, don't be discouraged by some of the news. Don't be discouraged when you read today's paper or if you watch Twitter. Paul says focus on his mighty strength, not the size of the problems around us, but the strength of the Lord that has won, that has been victorious, that has inaugurated a new humanity. So let's focus on his strength and let's encourage one another and pray and strengthen one another. So I'm going to ask, I think I'll just pray, invite the Lord. And I'm going to ask you to, maybe a few of the people that we've mentioned this morning, or others, that we could just end and take a few moments. I might have to do some suggestions of who prays, but to pray for some of these people and some of these things. Last week we prayed for timber and people that were sick and teachers, but we didn't pray together necessarily for Robin. I think it would be good to think of her, to pray again for John, and really just to pray that, the last few people that are still sick and there's no more, that they fully recover. We really want Lynn to experience a full and complete recovery, as well as Laurie and others. So let's welcome and invite the Lord. Lord, again, we want to say that we need your mighty strength. We need the armor that you provide. And we need the power and the strengthening of your Holy Spirit. So, Lord, I ask that with each and every one of us that is experiencing a battle, a fight of some sort, be it a large one that is about systemic evil, or be it just a personal struggle emotionally, physically. Lord, we want to ask that you would show us again that you are our strength. And we ask even now, Lord, that you would strengthen us. Come and show us again how to stand in the midst of the struggle. Come and encourage us again and teach us to fight and to be strong in you.